In the Western world, there is something very significant about the month of November. Remembrance Day.
Remembrance Day will be over by the time we get this out.
That may be, but the true meaning behind Remembrance Day is something that should never be over. We should be remembering it for the rest of the year as well. And that is why, I think if anything, it is very fitting that this video come out after the official commemoration is over. Good day everyone, 'tis I, the Blue Baron, defender of traditionalism. And I've been digging a World War I trench in our garden to honor, memorialize, and educate people about the brave soldiers on all sides who fought for God, King, and country in the trenches of the Great War. Let's talk while I continue digging. You may be wondering why I said on all sides. That is because here at Blue Baron Productions we look at history in a way that's unbiased by nation or by modernist lenses. If we look at history through any pre-existing mindset, it is the viewpoint and mindset of the people who lived in it. We honor and remember the brave monarchist, Canadian and British soldiers who bled and died in the Great War. But we are not too proud to admit the faults of our nation's governments that contributed to the war. I think this broader look at the facts is illustrated well by what I'm wearing, of which the main part consists of a Swiss tunic and pants, historically the most neutral nation, Imperial German field gear, calling to mind the Central Powers, and the originally British symbol of remembrance, the poppy. As I've said before, Remembrance Day means a whole lot to me. It probably means more to me than even to most combat veterans, because I look at it with the historical perspective of the values and lessons of its own time period. Everyone is constantly reminded to remember the soldiers who lost their lives, but what about all the other things that were lost because of World War I? What about all the things we have lost since then? World War I was a conflict which, few would deny, put the final nail in the coffin of the old, traditional, and, lest we forget, Christian Europe. The human cost was beyond imagination and only surpassed 20 years later by World War II. Even then, many countries lost far more troops in the First World War than in the Second. In addition to the individual lives that were lost, the conflict was also the end of an era in world history and certainly Western civilization. By the time it was over, the German Empire was gone, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was gone, the Russian Empire was gone, and the Ottoman Empire would soon be. Revolutionary communism had been set loose on the world, ethnic nationalism was set loose in the Balkans and the Middle East, the United States had been drawn out of isolation to become a world power, and faith in traditional institutions, such as the church and monarchy, had been shattered. World War I, and thus the Remembrance Day that we have because of it, is far more involved to me than simply remembering the members of a country's armed forces that have died in battle. Remembrance Day is about remembering our history, and actually understanding it. It's about knowing and honoring what our forefathers believed in and fought for, and teaching people about these things so that, in their own way, they may fight for them too. Remembrance Day is about understanding where we've come from, so that we may know where we are going. What started as a mixing trench dug to mix the compost from my bins into topsoil for the lawn, soon became a way to draw people here so I could share the lessons of history with them, in a way not skewed by modernist lenses, but rather improved by a viewpoint contemporary with the period we study. World War I was not about freedom. To say so is ignorant at best and blatantly dishonest at worst, and it certainly didn't achieve it. If anything, the results of the war, and the second bloodier war that followed it, made the world far less free and peaceful than it had been before. In the end, when it was all over, people, and not a few, looked at the millions of deaths, the fallen civilizations, the political and social chaos, and asked, was it all worth it? That remains something to struggle with even now, at least for those willing to give it sincere thought. Was the pride of Serbia worth such a horror? Was Alsace-Lorraine? Any given cause seems pretty small and inconsequential when weighed against the millions of casualties in fallen empires. Finding someone to blame is never as easy as it seems in such cases, though there were certainly guilty parties. The murderers of the Archduke, the Austrian foreign minister who lied to his sovereign in order to get him to declare war, the French ambassador in St. Petersburg who fomented war against Austria, the German blank check, and so on can all be justly blamed along with other individuals and actions. However, one thing that should never be blamed for it is the old order itself. Sir Winston Churchill famously said, "Democracy is more vindictive than cabinets. The wars of peoples will be more terrible than those of kings." World War I is a perfect example of this, and I am sure some will already be thinking that there was only the second bloodiest war in the history of humanity, and it came when the world was still a largely monarchist place. The truth, however, is not that simple. Among the major powers in Europe in August of 1914, there was not a single monarch that wanted war. Not one. Even the few who thought it might be necessary were certainly not pleased or enthusiastic about it. The Great War was a war of peoples rather than a war of kings, no doubt about it. In most cases, the monarchs felt they had no choice in the matter. The Tsar of Russia was extremely reluctant to get involved and struggled terribly over the decision. The Emperor of Austria had to actually be lied to in order to get him to go to war, and the German Kaiser actually ordered his troops to stand down at the last minute only to be defied by his top general. King George V was not really making the decision to go to war, and King Albert I of the Belgians simply had it thrust upon him. Sultan Mehmed V of the Ottoman Empire thought it was a terrible mistake, but he was not really the man in charge anymore either. Yet despite this, not one monarch of the Central Powers was to maintain his throne when all was said and done. Given what came 20 years later, that certainly did not make the world a safer place. It must also be said that these monarchs, as well as others, did far more to try and avert war than is mentioned here, and contrary to popular belief, His Imperial Majesty Kaiser Wilhelm II may well have done the most to try and avert the war. For a more thorough look at that, please watch my first Remembrance Month Special, link in description. If you are still with me through this lecture, then first, I appreciate you, and second, please take a moment to think on just what exactly was lost in the war that still hasn't been regained. From a symbolic perspective, the trenches like this one dug by the brave monarchist soldiers of the World War could easily be seen as massive, open graves, freshly dug and ready to have the dead deposited in them. As if that isn't poignant enough, it wasn't just soldiers from across Europe and the world that would die in the trenches. It was in many ways Europe itself that would go to its grave in those same trenches. As British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey said, perhaps showing some level of regret for the actions he took in fomenting the war, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." As monarchists, we know that these lamps still haven't been relit. They will not be until we learn the real lesson of World War I and just how it was politicians, democracy, and republicanism that caused it and allowed for another, even bloodier conflict to follow it. That World War II, in Europe at least, was a direct result of World War I, no one can deny. And it was specifically the loss of the monarchies of Germany and Austria-Hungary that was responsible. With the economic tumult that Germany went through, it is possible that Hitler could have still managed to have become a significant political figure. Not as likely, but possible. However, there is simply no way that someone like him could have come to power and maintained himself in power if Kaiser Wilhelm II had still been on the German and Prussian thrones. Under the constitution of the German Empire, the Chancellor was not elected by anyone but appointed by the Kaiser. Before the First World War, only one Chancellor was appointed who was not a prince or aristocrat, and the idea that an Austrian commoner with no higher education and no record of any sort of success behind him at all could have been appointed by the Kaiser is simply beyond belief. Furthermore, it is even less likely that someone who despised monarchy as much as he did, and who made no secret of that fact, would have ever been trusted with a royal appointment. And of course, even if he had been, he could have been dismissed at any time. There is simply no way Hitler could have become dictator of Germany if the monarchy had been retained after the First World War. The fact that its survival, and even more so its victory in the Great War, could have led to a better world long ago encouraged me to look up even more about it, and I discovered that it had plans afterward, through the use of buffer states like the German restored monarchies of the Kingdom of Poland, Grand Duchy of Lithuania, United Baltic Duchy, Kingdom of Finland, and Ukrainian Hetmanate, to tackle and end the rising threat of communism in Russia. Though they had contributed to its rise, the fact that they already had a plan to solve the problem they had contributed to is worthy of respect, and it is highly likely that with the surviving aid of the German Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire, coupled with the already existing aid of the British, French, and Americans, the Whites may well have won the Russian Civil War and restored the Tsar, crushing Soviet communism before it could begin, and no doubt making the world better for having done so. But, to stay on course, this is about the results of monarchies falling, not the war itself. Looking at the Middle East, there is no case more simple to illustrate the effects of World War I, since so little has changed since then, World War II not touching too much on the region. Prior to the Great War, there was not so much a Middle East at all, as it was almost entirely the Ottoman Empire. If there had been no Great War, if the Ottoman Empire had not collapsed, there would have been no Six-Day War, no Yom Kippur War, no Intifadas, no Iran-Iraq War, possibly no Iranian Revolution either, and with no Saddam Hussein there is no Gulf War, no Second Gulf War, no Ba'athist dictatorship in Syria, no Syrian Civil War, no Lebanese Civil War, and perhaps no rise of radical Islam. The Islamic State terrorists causing so much trouble today would have no reason to exist, as their caliphate would still be standing in the form of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, saying that, it must also be pointed out that, at the time of the Great War, the caliphate was not foremost on the minds of the Arab Muslims at that time. It is rather ironic to see these gangs and armies of Arab Muslims today fighting for an Islamic caliphate when, during the First World War, it was the Arab Muslims who fought alongside Christian powers like Britain and France to bring down the Ottoman Empire, and thus, ultimately, the last caliph of Islam, who was the Ottoman Sultan. For Europe, setting aside World War II, there is no doubt that the most ugly and horrific tragedies to befall the continent have been a direct result of World War I, and in many cases the dissolution of the dual empire of Austria-Hungary. There were tensions, of course, that would have existed in any case, but changes were coming, whether when Archduke Franz Ferdinand came to the throne or when Charles I received the crown. Both favored some changes, whether to unite the Slavic peoples into a third constituent kingdom or to federalize the whole empire. In any event, much of the anger would have been dissipated, and for what remained there was the combined strength of the others under the imperial crown to prevent it from becoming problematic. There may still have been some conflict between the Habsburg Empire and Serbia, but perhaps, after shedding some other smaller minorities and their territory to win wider support, the Slavs would have become united as part of the Habsburg Empire. Who is to say? In any event, had Austria-Hungary not been dissolved, there would have been no Croatian and Slovenian wars, no Bosnian War, and no ethnic cleansing such as was seen in the traumatic breakup of Yugoslavia. With no Russian Revolution, there would have been no Russian Civil War, no rise of communism, definitely no Cold War as we know it, and possibly no nuclear arms race either, no Communist China or North Korea, no Vietnam War, and none of the cultural genocide that has befallen the world due to communist hatred of traditional authority. World War I was not necessary, and it certainly wasn't about freedom, nor did it make any country freer. As sad as it may seem today, the sacrifices made by the brave soldiers of World War I did nothing for the cause of freedom, nor were they intended to. and they certainly weren't made for the cause of democracy. Most of the soldiers did not even believe in democracy. If World War I had never happened, the world would be a much better place, and even if it had happened, at least to some extent, people all across the globe would have been spared considerable suffering if the monarchs of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Russia had not lost their thrones in the process. Not a single monarch, it should be remembered, wanted war, and yet, thanks to the politicians that surrounded them all, that is what the world got. Thus, rather than being an example against monarchy, I think the whole sorry affair of the run-up to World War I is an abject lesson of just why it is monarchs rather than politicians who should be entrusted with foreign policy. For history has shown time and time again that by acting as fathers or mothers to their people, sovereigns are far less likely to wage wars of aggression than politicians who do so largely for selfish reasons like personal gain or to settle scores. In contrast, a sovereign, as I've said before, by virtue of being the patriarch of their people, are far less likely to risk the lives of their people, and as a result set the bar much higher when going to war. Consequently, if the decision to go to war had been left solely at the discretion of George V, Wilhelm II, Franz Joseph, and Nicholas II, and their wishes adhered to by their political and military servants, then war would either not have happened, or at least been greatly reduced in both its scope and severity, as would its ensuing consequences, namely, the weakening of Europe, the rise of fascism and communism, World War II, the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations, the emergence of the United States as the dominant world power, the Cold War, the European Union, and the fall of monarchies around the world especially, a price that was certainly not worth paying. The Great War was meant to be the war to end all wars. It was a lie. If anything, it was the war that ended peace. The world had never been more violent and bloody than when the supposed champions and representatives of the people took power from the kings and princes. Not a single monarch, it should be remembered, wanted war, and yet thanks to the politicians that surrounded them all, that is what the world got. Even today, what peace prevails is mostly the peace of people who cannot be bothered to go to war over anything. Wars, in our democratic Republican age, have become a tool of politicians rather than a continuation of politics. We still fight, we still kill and bomb and destroy, but we don't call it war. We do so for vague reasons, against vague enemies, and end up with vague outcomes. Wars no longer have a beginning and an end. Instead, we have interventions, escalations, and they just go on until the public loses interest. But we are ruled by politicians rather than monarchs, so everyone thinks it is all okay. And that is the mentality that has produced the undeniable fact that no regimes in human history have been so oppressive and blood-soaked as those that have peoples or democratic in their names. Mankind would do well to consider that. Lest this all be too depressing, we can at least find some virtue in the fact that the soldiers at least had pure motives. Not freedom, certainly not democracy, but something real, concrete, and virtuous. For most of the soldiers in the armies on both sides of the Great War, they fought for the same thing: God, King, and country. Whether they fought for the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Tsardom of Bulgaria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, or Britain and her empire, they all had this in common. When a soldier fought, he did so in service of three things, in that order. He served his God, he served his king, the monarch of his nation who was appointed by God to lead him, and he served his country, his people. But the one I'd like to emphasize is the one that is so forgotten today, that the soldiers in World War I fought in service of their monarchy. They didn't volunteer to fight because of some vague notions of freedom, as is so often thought today. Nor was this notion of freedom the reason why they were willing to sacrifice so much. What motivated them, by and large, was service to God, King, and country, which in those days were seen as inseparably linked. To be Russian was to be a loyal subject of the Tsar, emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, who the peasantry lovingly called the Little Father, calling to mind the Heavenly Father who put him in place. The history of Austria was bound up with the history of the imperial royal House of Habsburg, and to be Austrian meant to be a loyal follower of the House of Habsburg and share in the legacy of being the successor state to the Holy Roman Empire, and the defenders of Europe from Muslim invasion for hundreds of years. The history and culture of the individual German states was alive in their individual monarchs, and reigning at the top of this union was the German Kaiser, representing all Germans as well as the unique history of the Kingdom of Prussia. And of course, to be British did not mean merely a resident of the United Kingdom, but rather it meant to be a subject of the King or Queen of Britain, and part of an entity much greater than oneself, the British Empire and later British Commonwealth. And in the spirit of Remembrance Day, let us never forget that this is what our forefathers fought for on both sides of World War I. I'm the Blue Baron, defender of traditionalism. God bless you all, and remember, Fides Traditio Monarchia! Alright folks, that's about the end for now. Unfortunately, I broke the camera mount when I knocked over the tripod, so I couldn't continue filming the digging process. However, I can show you what it looks like now that it's just about finished. I'll be digging it a bit deeper, but as far as width and length goes, this is about the finished project, considering I can't do much more in my grandmother's vegetable garden. So, however, if you want to see me improve the trench, dig it deeper, put more bracing in, put in alcoves, things like that, and one day, hopefully, dig a bigger one in an area more conducive to it, then please consider donating to my PayPal or pledging monthly to my Patreon to help me finance and improve this trench, as well as convince my grandmother that it's a worthwhile use of her vegetable garden. But most importantly, your support will ensure that I am able to continue using this trench to give people the true historical viewpoint of World War I and history in general. For those of you who are already pan-monarchists, I urge you to dig deep. We're always wishing there were more people fighting for monarchism, and I'm giving you the opportunity to actually support someone who is. I can't do it alone. I'm not even asking you to be out there fighting for it yourself. You can simply be an anonymous donor. Together, we can make a difference. And fight on for God, King, and country.
By all the